series of masterclasses. We're just waiting for everyone to come into the room this evening. So just while everybody's coming in, if you want to share any of your details, do so you can use the chat button below. We are really excited to hear from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, but just want to wait a few more seconds to make sure that everybody who's signed up for this evening can get into the room. But do share with us your details in the chat button, share where you're dialing in from, which companies you're dialing in from, and you'll be able to network with other members through that chat button. I think we're almost there. A few more people coming in. Great. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of leadership masterclasses that are sponsored by Rathbones. My name is Kirsty Maxey. I'm the chair of the IoD City Financial Services Interest Group and CEO of Team Spirit. Tonight, we're going to hear from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, but before we meet her, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Institute of Directors. Here, we believe that better directors make better businesses, and for just £35 a month, membership provides you with access to a whole range of useful business tools, from networking to free tax and legal advice. And now we also have access to a whole range of meeting places and lounges that have all opened back up. One of the key benefits of membership is access to our professional training programs, which are designed and delivered by directors for directors all over the world. And they've helped set the standard for good corporate governance. This event is part of the IoD Business Extra webinar series, which is providing insight and added value to all of our members. On the next slide, you can see the agenda for the evening, which focuses on the interview, and there are two ways you can get involved at the bottom of your screen. Firstly, as I said earlier, you can use the chat button, and you can do that to share your details with other attendees, where you're dialing in from, which country you're dialing in from, which company you're dialing in from. There's also a special LinkedIn post in the chat box, and you can use that to comment, and then you can connect with all the other attendees. Secondly, if you want to ask questions to Lisa, then there's a Q&A button. So use that section to ask questions, not the chat section. The great thing about the Q&A is that you can upvote questions that you like and want to see answered. And finally, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. Now I'd like to introduce you to our sponsor of the Leadership Masterclass series. And tonight that's Joanna Pennington-Jones. She's the Investment Director based in Liverpool at Rathbones and specialises in managing bespoke investment portfolios on behalf of private individuals, charities and entrepreneurs. Welcome, Joanna, and over to you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's Institute of Directors Leadership Series, sponsored by Rathbones. I'm honoured to be involved in these events, which have brought us thoroughly interesting and impressive series of speakers. Tonight is, of course, Lisa Nandy, currently Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs since her appointment in April 2020, and MP for Wigan since 2010, where she was elected aged just 30. During her political career, she has worked with charities, focusing on children, young refugees and housing, and more recently has also been Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. It is clear that Lisa is someone who cares about people and about the world around us, and I look forward to hearing more about her endeavours shortly. Since joining Rathbones just over 2 years ago, I've been impressed and proud of the company's efforts to act responsibly in every aspect of what we do. For example, our charitable efforts to support people and communities came to the fore last year as we increased our efforts to donate to food banks and mental health charities during the hugely difficult months of lockdown. As a company that works closely with the charity sector, we are aware of how difficult the COVID pandemic has been for charities, with donations lower than usual and more people struggling than ever. Another aspect of how Rathbones acts responsibly is in terms of understanding our impact on the world and environment, both in terms of our operations and the investments that we make. We work hard behind the scenes to minimise our operational footprint, but also take very seriously our potential to invest for change by considering all aspects of environmental, social and governance issues in the investments that we choose. We take our stewardship responsibilities very seriously, using our shareholder votes actively. We are one of the original signatories to the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment Charter. We have had a dedicated ESG arm for nearly 25 years, but more than that, we apply an ESG overlay to all our company research to identify risks and opportunities. The Rathbones family and company history is one of acting for good, campaigning for social reform and positive change, and we continue to look forward into the world around us and do what we can to act responsibly. And now I'm delighted to hand you over to Alastair and Lisa, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Lovely to hear from Rathbones today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Lisa Nandy. Lisa, are you with us?
Hi, good evening.
Lisa, lovely to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here today. I'm delighted to have you on board. Just instead of me trying to introduce you, Lisa, why don't I ask you to do a little bit about that? Just say, if you could say where you started, a little bit how you got to where you are today, and perhaps what your priorities are at the moment. It'd be great to hear.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. And thanks very much for having me. I think I said earlier that there may be a 6-year-old having a bath at some point next door in the bathroom. So apologies if we get interrupted by a lot of singing. Yeah, so my name's Lisa Nandy. I was elected, as you just heard, in 2010. But before I came into elected politics, I suppose the thing that really drove me to do it was that I was working in the charity sector with children and young people. I worked first at the charity Centrepoint with young homeless teenagers after I left university, and many of them were child refugees, which led me to then go on to the Children's Society and run our work with child refugees and their families there. And in all of that time, almost a decade in the voluntary sector, what I really felt in the end was that the circumstances of those kids' lives, despite all of their best efforts, despite all of their passion, their ambition, their efforts to make a better future for themselves, so much of it had been set before they were even born. We live in a country where the circumstances of your parents are the largest determinant in the circumstances of your own life. And in the end, for all of the good efforts and the good work that was being done, I just felt that only politics could change that, because it's about power, who has it and who doesn't. And that's what led me to stand for Parliament in 2010 for Wigan, which is not my home seat. I come from Bury originally, but it's close enough as part of Lancashire. And people here in Wigan don't tell us we're from Greater Manchester, because we won't have it for a minute. We're Lancashire. And so it brought me home. It brought me back from a decade in London, back to the northwest of England. And I've kind of been fighting the fight for areas like mine for the last 11 years from the opposition benches, sadly, but I'm absolutely determined that the next couple of years is going to be when that changes.
Excellent. And just what are your current priorities at the moment? What's in your in tray that you can tell us about?
Well, I guess, you know, the job of the Shadow Foreign Secretary is to do a number of things. It's to hold the government to account, to make sure that we apply a level of consistency to the way that we approach our dealings with the rest of the world. I think the UK has gained a reputation in recent years of being an unreliable actor on the world stage, whether it's, you know, threats to tear up the withdrawal agreement unilaterally and break international law that really did send sort of shockwaves around the world amongst our allies, and also were noted very much by authoritarian regimes as well, or whether it's the confusion about where Britain sits in the world post-Brexit. Who do we want to form alliances with? Where are we going to find our friends and our influence? These things are all things that it's really important that you have a strong opposition to hold the government to account. But more than anything else, the opposition has to provide an alternative. And I feel very much that there is a vacuum there at the moment. There isn't a strong story that is being told about the future of Britain post-Brexit. You know, I'm someone who campaigned for Remain. I wanted to very much to remain, and I'd still, you know, regret the fact that we left. But politics is about looking to the future, and there is no appetite at all from me, hasn't been for years, to rehash old arguments. That question was settled. And the question now is, how do we go out and build those friends and alliances out in the world in order to build a better future for this country? And that is very much, you know, as much as being an opposition, our job is to be an alternative. And that's something that I'm very preoccupied with at the moment. I'm writing a book, although don't tell the publishers, but I haven't written a word yet. But the idea is that, you know, somehow we've got to lay out a story for the future of this country, who we are, what we're about, and how we fit in the world. And so that's something that is occupying a great deal of my time, and the very interesting conversations that I'm able to have with a wide variety of people, whether it's people in Wigan, and as you can imagine at the moment, Batley and Spen, where I'm spending a great deal of time, to understand better how foreign policy could work for them and deliver on the very difficult circumstances that a lot of people find themselves in, or whether it's world leaders that Keir and I have been Zooming with over the last 12 months. We unfortunately can't go anywhere. I think I'll be the first Shadow Foreign Secretary to never travel further than Hartlepool, but nevertheless, we've been Zooming with world leaders, which has been, you know, a really quick and good way to get into conversations with people all over the world who feel that COVID-19 is a moment where we break apart, or we recognise the value of coming together and working together to deliver on the things that matter to us. And so that's a lot of my my time at the moment.
Yeah. And taking that forward, what's your view of the current state of the nation? What's the national mood at the moment? You know, you've said you were in Hartlepool, but you've also been battling Spain. You know, when you're speaking to people, what's their mood at the moment?
So I think endurance is the mood. You know, stoicism, endurance, we've got to get through it. I think people are pretty weary, but very, very focused on what is happening right now, and, you know, trying to get through it. And in lots of ways, we've seen the best of the British spirit coming out, the national spirit, over the last few months, where people have stepped forward to deliver the vaccine and to volunteer and to get, you know, food banks opened where there weren't any, to help people who were struggling. And saw it with that great effort that Marcus Rashford led to get children fed in the school holidays, businesses coming forward, you know, loads of them in my constituency struggling themselves, but said, come, you know, let us know you need a you know, half-term lunches, no stigma, nobody needs to know. You're welcome anytime. And it's been you know, in lots of ways that's been incredibly inspiring. But I think the mood will change very quickly in the next few months. I think people are starting to look to the future already. And when we emerge from the immediate health crisis, I think there will be a level of reflection about what's happened and perhaps how it could have been different. I think there may be a reassessment of priorities and the values on which we base decisions in this country. I'm thinking, you know, a lot about the way that we clap for carers and the strength of feeling about public sector workers, and but also, you know, supermarket workers, delivery drivers. We've got a newfound appreciation for the people who look after us, I think, and perhaps will demand a better settlement for them. And I also think that what's been neglected a lot in this crisis has been young people. And I think we're going to start to see not just the full extent of how difficult this has been for young people, but I think we're going to see an increased demand from them and from their parents to do better by this generation. You know, just for this audience in particular, one of the things that I'm dealing with at the moment is a lot of young people in Wigan who haven't been able to get work experience. Wigan is the sort of place where you're often the first in your family to go to university. They're going to university, but they're sitting on Zoom calls like this. They're finding it very hard to navigate. They don't have anything to compare it to. And for this generation in particular, I think they've been hugely disadvantaged by this, and we're gonna have to work together. I think, you know, whether it's civil society, business, government, we're going to have to work together to turn things around for this generation.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to ask you a few questions in relation to your portfolio. I'll start with a nice easy one, which is about China. And that's many people on this in the audience have got business interests in China. How do we balance the UK's commercial interests in China with the human rights issues that involvement in China brings up? How do we steer that particular path?
Well, with some difficulty is the honest answer. I don't think the world has ever had to deal with a challenge like this one. There is a view amongst some MPs in Parliament that this is a new Cold War situation. You could see that playing out during the Huawei debate about its role in our 5G network. But in truth, this is far more complex than that. There's no global challenge that can be solved without the involvement of the Chinese government, whether it's COVID-19, climate change, or anything else. But yet there is a real problem with the increasingly assertive, at times aggressive behaviour by China, not just in relation to its own people. The Uyghur and the situation in Xinjiang is something that exercises me, and I'm sure many of your members, a lot, and the appalling situation in Hong Kong, but also in relation to the norms, the international norms and rules to which we are supposed to adhere, and the challenge that China and the actions of the Chinese government present to them as well, particularly in the South China Sea and in relation to Taiwan. So, it's my view that we've got to take a far less naive and far more strategic approach to China. Ironically, the Chinese are quite good at this themselves. They have leading strategy groups, which are normally chaired by the very senior level, prime ministerial level, that deal with cross-governmental challenges. Seems to me our government could learn something from that. On the one hand, at the moment, you've got a far more robust approach from the Foreign Office towards China, but then you've got the business department still considering handing over large chunks of our nuclear energy infrastructure to Chinese-backed companies. We're going to obviously continue to trade with China. We're going to continue to do business. We shouldn't be doing dealings with companies based in Xinjiang, in my view, and we put that view forward very forcefully in Parliament. We shouldn't be seeking to do preferential trade deals either with China when China stands accused of genocide, and in our view, given the difficulties of proving the legal threshold without access to Xinjiang, the international community ought to treat this as genocide until it's proven otherwise. So we shouldn't be doing preferential trade deals. So we're going to have to find a way to have far more strategic independence from China. That means working with allies to provide alternatives on critical infrastructure like the 5G network. It means investing in homegrown industries. It means getting, working around the structures that currently are blocking any concerted international action. So the structure that we've got at the moment is the United Nations. It's still of great value, of course, and great importance, but we've got to find new structures in which we can work to counter the aggressive, assertive behaviour by China. But then the other pillar of that, along with strategic independence, is constructive engagement. And we've got to have forums and mechanisms in which to engage with the Chinese government, to be able to work with the Chinese government. Cultural exchanges is one of those areas where I part ways with some of the conservative backbenchers that we've formed an alliance with over issues like genocide. I think cultural exchanges between Chinese students and the UK and UK students and China are one of the ways in which we help to leverage our influence and use our soft power, and also maintain links with the Chinese people who are not at all responsible for the actions of their own government. So it's what William Hague calls the twin pillar approach. And I was really struck listening to him give evidence to a select committee a few months ago where he was asked, do you think that really is possible? And he said, I don't know, but we've sure as hell got to try. And it feels to me that the world is feeling our way on this at the moment.
And one of the centerpieces of Chinese foreign policy has been the One Belt, One Road initiative. At the G7 meeting last week, there was an alternative vision set forth by some of the G7 members in relation to an alternative One Belt, One Road initiative. What's Labour's view on that? And do you see any downsides to that approach?
And so I think two things. One is that I absolutely support the principle of providing an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think the way in which the Chinese government has been able to use what's often called debt trap diplomacy in order to put forward much needed either low-cost finance or aid to other countries. You can see that happening at the moment with COVID, and the slowness with which Western governments have been able to come up with vaccines for developing countries has meant China has stepped into that gulf, and that has had serious political consequences. There is a reason why many developing countries vote with China on issues like investigations into war crimes in Syria, for example, at UN level, and block any kind of meaningful progress on those. And so the West has to take that really seriously. We could do this in a way that was actually beneficial to us, not just politically and globally, but here at home as well. Providing financing, for example, for net zero projects, green projects around the world would help us to tackle climate change as well. It would help to forge partnerships with other countries, particularly where they have access to the raw materials, that would help us to develop partnerships to make sure that the battery technology of the future was being designed by kids in Stockton, as well as as well as the sort of assembling the solar panels. So there's a way in which we could do this. It'll take more ambition than the G7 was able to agree. I think all eyes are now on the G20 and COP26 to see if we can do a bit better with that. It'll take a bit more imagination in terms of financing and making sure that debt can be repaid, but it also means that we've got to think more strategically about issues like aid. International aid has become a political football in the last year. In fact, I say it's become a political football. I have to be honest, it's not a political football. There is a cross-party consensus in Parliament that international aid is a really important part of the UK soft power, and it's also a moral imperative. But the Prime Minister doesn't agree. And I think that's a huge strategic mistake. It doesn't just set us back in terms of our ability to deal with some of those big global problems and to counter the rise of China. It also means that we're putting ourselves at an enormous disadvantage in terms of national security and other areas. And national security is another reason why I think we need to take seriously what is happening here in the UK. So the Belt and Road, the alternative, was very much focused on providing help to developing countries to counter the rise of China. But actually, we're seeing this here in the UK as well. So my own council, for example, has just granted a contract to a Chinese-backed company. It's only for construction and not handing over sensitive information or providing an ongoing role or stake. And this company doesn't have any dealings in Xinjiang. But there are many councils who wouldn't have done that much due diligence. You know, they've had huge funding cuts from central government, so they're very reliant on countries' overseas finance, particularly from China. This is something that the government has just simply not taken seriously, and still isn't taking seriously when you look at things like energy. And so I think while it's absolutely right that we see this as a critical national security issue overseas, we should also see it as one here in the UK as well.
And Lisa, in relation to G7, just continuing some of their deliberations from last week, they did set out this concept of the minimum corporation tax level and all that type of thing. Is that something that you support? And also, can you see those proposals being able to stick? Because there are very inventive people around the world that try and defeat these types of proposals.
Look, I mean, I feel very strongly about this, and the reason that I do is because I live in a town where people voted by 2-1 to leave the European Union. They weren't just people who had long wanted to leave the EU or, felt that they wanted to send a message to the establishment. They were people who felt, a lot of them people who were lifelong Labour voters, lifelong trade unionists, who had come to see the global system as well as the national system as part of the problem that was creating problems in their own lives, and certainly not standing up and defending them when things went wrong. And the more that I spent time campaigning in parts of the country like mine, like Bolton, like Sunderland, many parts of the country where people who had once felt decades ago that the EU was part of the solution now very much felt that it was part of the problem. And the story that they told as I travelled around the country was very much one of a local problems felt locally, whether it's, the collapse of football clubs like mine that was thrown away for a gambling debt on the other side of the world, flooding, the frequent floods that afflict homes and businesses all over the north of England now every single year, fraud, the growing number of fraud cases that is now the biggest thing in my caseload, I think, biggest single thing, international crime gangs that target older people. All these things are problems that are felt locally but can only be solved globally. And yet every time people looked at the global system, they didn't see any protection for them. What they saw was a group of people who were in it for themselves and were milking the system for everything that it was worth. And Greensill, I think, the scandal that's been uncovered there shines a light on a system where you can have people who can go across the world gaining unprecedented access to governments and using that leverage to bet the house in the knowledge that if you win big, but if you lose, then it's not you, it's never you, it's somebody else who shoulders the appalling losses. And you can see that with the steel workers in Rotherham as a consequence. This is the sort of thing that gives rise then to the political earthquakes that we've seen in recent years. The dramatic rise in populism, the attacks on scapegoating of migrants, the rise in big strongman macho leaders all around the world who promise cheap solutions to complex problems. And, we scratch our heads in Westminster and we wonder how on earth this has come to pass. But you only have to go and spend half an hour talking to somebody who lost their job because it was offshored. And it was offshored because of a model of trade across the world that allows cheap goods to flood the market, and suddenly their wages, their living conditions, their family lives and the fabric of their community, all the things that depend on those good wages and good conditions at work, suddenly become part of the problem and are seen as part of the problem by the politicians that are supposed to protect them. So in a nutshell, I see the global minimum corporation tax as the first effort made by global leaders, sadly not ours, but by others, to step forward and start to remedy some of this. And I think President Biden is quite clear that this is the first in a series of steps in which foreign policy is going to start to deliver for people in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as deliver for people across the world. And I am wholeheartedly on board with that agenda. And
is the recent trade deal that's been announced in relation to Australia, is that also part of that process? Are we going to see more of those, and are people going to take comfort from the fact that there is a better international linkage through these types of deals?
Well, I think better international linkage is important. And to take Australia as an example, the Five Eyes partnership is incredibly important to them. And there's a really live debate going on at the moment about whether we ought to strengthen and deepen that level of cooperation, and particularly to take more of a focus around China. I mean, we certainly in the Labour Party, since Keir was elected, we spent a great deal of time talking up to our friends over in the United States. We've spoken to the government, but we also work very closely with the Australian Labour Party because they were really at the sharp end of the treatment of China long before we were. So all of the things that we're grappling with, like influence on universities and trade wars, they were dealing with quite some time ago. So that, it's really important that we work together on these things. But I think in terms of the trade deal in particular, I think this goes right to the heart of the question about what sort of country we want to be after Brexit. And during the referendum, the EU referendum, one of the things that I spent quite a lot of time, I went to Nissan, for example, in Sunderland, the request to the management to talk to the workforce to say, look, these jobs will probably go if you vote leave. And the workforce told me a story about 40 years of economic decline and how this referendum was the last line of defence for them, and that good jobs matter, but so too does their entire community, which they've seen under strain for all of that time. But when I talked to the management afterwards, to say to them what would persuade you to stay, I mean, a good Brexit deal would be, less friction, much closer alignment would be the first thing. And the second thing is skills, that there's a reason why they're based in the northeast of England, because of the skills base there that's been built up over many years. So it seems to me there are two things the government can do. One is to get far take a completely different approach to those trade deals so that they don't drive down the standards here in the United Kingdom. We ought to have regulatory alignment as far as possible with the EU, in my view. But the second would be to invest in skills here. That is the future of Britain after Brexit. That is where I think we can gain a competitive edge if we turn Britain into a high skill, well-paid, well-treated economy, and we work at a global level to make sure that the global trade system that we have underpins that. At the moment, the government is getting it wrong on both counts, spending more on Eat Out to Help Out than on children's catch-up education, and that's got to change.
And just a reminder to our audience that you're listening to me, Alastair King, interview Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. This event is kindly sponsored by Rathbones. Now, Lisa, just in relation to the trade deals, etc., we've touched on the one in relation to Australia, the big one that was announced on Christmas Eve with the European Union. That was it had some elements in relation to traded goods, but not an awful lot in relation to financial services, professional services, and that type of thing. And the Australian deal mirrored that as well. There's not an awful lot of meat when it came to actual sort of financial and professional services. Given the composition of our audience, a lot of people involved in financial professional services, I just wondered, what would you do in order to try and drive some of that extra growth in those areas, particularly those areas where the United Kingdom has such a lead?
And so during the leadership contest, which seems about 1 million years ago now, thank goodness, one of the things that I said is that we need to think much smarter about how we do trade deals with other countries. So, the trade deals that we currently do are quite clunky. They tend to be bilateral trade deals based on things like agriculture, which is good. It's an important part of the UK economy, but we need to be far smarter about seeking out allies around the world with whom we can do pluralistic trade deals on areas like services. So, the example that I think I gave was around Japan, and there's a lot of scope to do trade deals with countries like Japan on services, countries that are democracies that observe the rule of law, but I can't remember the last time that you really heard UK politicians particularly talking about that. So I think there's a lot of scope for us to do that. Particularly because if you take a company like Rolls-Royce, for example, the actual building of the parts is far less significant than the service contracts that go alongside them. So there'd be an enormous benefit to the UK of exploring that and getting much more modern in the way that we approach those trade deals. But I think there's a wider political point as well around Europe, and we voted for the deal that, I voted for the last one, to be honest. I was desperate to get a deal with the EU because I sort of was watching what was about to unfold and thought this, the deal that Theresa May was putting forward was likely to be the best that was going to be on offer at any point. But we all voted in the Labour Party for the deal that was put forward last Christmas, and paper thin as it was, we very much see that as the floor, not the ceiling of what can be achieved. And that will take better relationships, not just bilaterally with EU countries. I think the government is there. I think at least the Foreign Secretary, who I shadow, is very much there in terms of wanting to see good relationships with France, with Germany and others. Not sure the Prime Minister quite agrees, but actually with the EU itself, if you don't have a good relationship with the EU itself, then it's got to be robust, it's got to stand up for British interests, of course, that's right. But if you have a very, very antagonistic relationship with the EU itself, it will undermine your relationships with other EU countries. And the only way forward for Britain, in my view, we're out of the EU, that's settled, but our future lies with Europe, and we've got to build better relationships with our EU counterparts, which means ending the needless antagonism between the EU and the UK.
And developing that, we've seen a lot of attention being devoted to building trade relationships with the EU, which is perhaps a slower growing part of the world. In relation to the faster growing parts of the world in the Far East and in India, etc., what policies would Labour develop in order to promote UK businesses there? Because I think some of the feeling is among sort of the audience might be that some of those initiatives have been hidden under a bush, and I just sort of sense that I wonder whether there's is there a way in which the Labour government would take that forward in order to promote it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's part of the world with which I'm incredibly familiar. A lot of the participants on this might not know, but I'm half Indian. My dad's from Kolkata, and I still have family over there. And it's a part of the world that is increasing in importance for the global economy. And you can see that with the way in which the Prime Minister was so keen not to cancel his trip to see Modi over in India that he ended up delaying lockdown and measures at the borders, and here we all are still in lockdown as a consequence. But you can see that from that story how important the not just India but that region is to the UK in terms of trade, but also in terms of security issues and dealing with China and so on. I guess what I would say though is that we make no apology in the Labour Party for saying you've got to get the relationship with Europe right first. The EU is our biggest trading partner by far. And one of the things that I think has been hugely neglected in the debate around Brexit and the impact that trade deals have on British business is smaller and medium-sized businesses. So to give you an example, I have Heinz here in my constituency. They're a brilliant company and they've just brought ketchup back to Britain. We're trying to persuade them to put made in Wigan on the label, although they're a holding firm at the moment, but we'll get them. But they're a business that I was very, very worried about because they're a major employer. And then my first phone call after the result came in that we were going to leave was to Heinz to say, what can I do to persuade you to stay? And actually they'd invested already in contingency planning. They don't deal in perishables. They've bought up warehouses so that if there was disruption at the border, there wasn't going to be a huge problem. But they were very clear with me that they were able to do that because of the size of the company. The ones that I'm far more worried about are, there's a company in my constituency called King's Quality Foods. It employs about 50 people. It's a great local firm that does a lot of meat production. They don't have those luxuries. They can't pull strings at the borders. They haven't got warehouses. They deal in perishables. These are the companies that I'm far more worried about. And the statistics bear this out, but certainly from my own experience back here in Wigan, this is the problem at the moment that businesses are really grappling with, not just in food, but in lots of other areas as well, really, really struggling with the new rules and regulations, needing to have a base in other countries and the amount of paperwork that goes with it. These are the things that we've got to get sorted as an urgent priority. I think in some ways COVID has masked the impact that this has had, but it is having an impact. And given that COVID is going to cost us in terms of the UK economy, we can't afford to have the perfect storm of COVID and Brexit together.
What's the mood in the Labour Party at the moment? How are, when you're speaking to your colleagues, are people sort of upbeat, downbeat? How are things at the moment?
It was kind of weird because we haven't been in Parliament and we don't meet locally. And so I'd be lying a bit, to be honest, if I said I really knew. Spend a lot of time talking to colleagues on the phone and over Zoom, endless Zoom. And I think, I do see people when I go into Parliament, but it feels a bit like a sort of ghost town at the moment. There's the Speaker has rightly said, we've got to lead by example. And so there are very few people there. And as someone who lives up north and has had to trek down to London a lot over the last 11 years, I don't regret that really. It's quite nice to be at home, but it's difficult to really gauge it. I guess what I would say is generally in politics, most politicians seem to be absorbing the anxiety of their constituents, of their families, and that the mood is not just amongst Labour politicians, but also amongst Tory politicians is one of, it feels quite tense, to be honest. People are very anxious as well about what's going to come next. And as we unlock and as we start to see the extent of the damage to the economy, what it's going to mean for jobs and livelihoods and so on. So I think that's, it's not a very sort of Westminster bubbly answer because, everyone wants to know whether we all love Keir Starmer or whether we're all at loggerheads. And you probably want to know if I'm running a secret leadership bid from our spare room here in Wigan. But actually, mostly what we're all focused on, Tory and Labour, is just that it feels like this is a big moment for the country, and we can't gauge politics that well. I mean, I've been out campaigning in Hartlepool and Batley and Spen recently for obvious reasons, and I think the country is feeling a bit like that as well. So it's quite an odd and quite an anxious time, I suppose, is the truth.
And just to finish off my sort of formal questions, Lisa, it's a question I ask all of my guests, and that is in 1979. It was a time of pretty miserable sort of time here in the United Kingdom, and Ian Dury and the Blockheads released a track called "Reasons to Be Cheerful" Part 3, and he just listed a whole load of things that made him happy that perhaps weren't very obvious. And I just wondered, well, what are your reasons to be cheerful at the moment, Lisa?
Well, I think to answer the question that I posed a minute ago, one of my reasons to be cheerful is that I'm not in that Labour leadership contest anymore. And so that gives you an answer as to whether I'm running a secret leadership bid or not. I said before that there's only one job that I'm interested in, and that's Dominic Raab's, and I've absolutely got my sights on that. But that is genuinely one of the things, is that Labour has been so divided over recent years. And when we went into that leadership contest, I rang Keir and I spoke to Becky and said, it'd be good if we could do this in a way that the next Labour leader comes out strengthened, not weakened by the process. And I think we really did. You could probably see on that platform, like when we were going around doing these interminable hustings, that we do actually like each other. Becky lives locally. She's got a son the same age or just slightly older than mine, so a lot of the same pressures. Keir I've known for years and really like, and I think we did model it well. And so I'm cheerful that we got through that and came out of it stronger as a party, and that I played a part in that. And I'm also very, very cheerful not to be in it anymore. I guess the other thing to say is that I guess for all of the pain and heartache and misery of the last few years and the trauma and bereavement, and I wouldn't wish this on anyone, and the amount of sacrifice that people have had to give, and the strain particularly on our front line, which I think is only just starting to show, for all of that, it does feel to me like we had a sort of moment where people really did step up and showed exactly what we could be as a country. And when I speak to counterparts around the world, I was mentioning zooming into world leaders' houses. Keir and I zoomed into Jacinda Ardern's kitchen the other day. She has a particularly nice kitchen. One of the things that we talk about is the fact that this is a moment where the world can choose to break apart, or we can choose to come together. And we've seen that spirit on display, perhaps not from our world leaders. In China, in the United States, we saw exactly the opposite of that during the pandemic. But here, but through the World Health Organization and the scientists that Jonathan Ashworth and I speak to regularly, private sector and public sector, those scientists have worked together, even as geopolitical tensions have risen, even as the atmosphere has got more toxic. Chinese scientists, US scientists, EU scientists, UK scientists, and taken together, they found already the treatment, diagnostics and vaccines that have saved millions and millions of lives. And that's the spirit I think we need to summon up for the future. That's when Labour wins. We've only won it 3 times in our history, when we've had an ambitious, optimistic story to tell about the future of this country. And I feel like we've borne witness to it over the last 12 months, and now we've got to give voice to it. So that's the reason to be cheerful. That's only 2, but I reckon that'll do. Yeah,
excellent. No, thank you very much indeed. We're going to go now to questions from the audience. Lisa, I've got a first question here from Sarup. He's asking about whether it should be, when dealing with China, is the answer to put some sanctions against China in order to get some of the outcomes that we need. Are sanctions the answer?
So I think sanctions can be the answer, and we were very supportive of Dominic Raab introducing the Magnitsky Act, which has been a long campaign for him and a long time coming, and we strongly support it. It's not, it needs strengthening. Corruption is not currently in scope. And the truth is that unless corruption is in scope, those sanctions are always going to be limited. You have to follow the money. If you want to get to human rights abuses, you have to follow the money. He knows that. In his earlier work, he was quite clear about it. Whether he can convince the Treasury and number 10 of that is another matter. But, we are allies on that. And I think sanctions can be an important tool in our armoury. But they have to be used in concert with other people. to be effective. And what we've seen recently is sanctions applied to UK parliamentarians and a UK law firm by China that were used much more as a way to send a message and fire a warning shot than they were to actually have an impact. We've got to make sure that sanctions actually have an impact. That means that we need friends and we need allies who we can work with. And that's one of the reasons why I firmly believe that the UK's government's position towards the EU is a nonsense. If you look at what the Cheerful attack, the chemical weapons attack on the streets of Salisbury a few years ago, Theresa May expelled 30 Russian diplomats. She was absolutely right to do that, in my view. But where did she go for help and support? When she did that, she went straight to our partners and friends in the EU. And we ought to be mindful of that. The EU and the UK moving in step on sanctions is far more effective than just the UK trying to do it. The UK can send a message, but together we can actually make change happen.
Lovely. Thank you, Lisa. I've got a question from Alex. He's saying some say it is not the Tories winning, rather Labour losing. What should Labour do to actually get its skin in the game when it comes to credibility?
I think credibility is a really good question. In our constitution, one of the first lines in our constitution, it says Labour seeks the trust of the people to govern. And trust has been in short supply between Labour and the public for quite some time, and I think that is a big job. And I'm not in any sense proposing to have all the answers. And although the UK is clearly not the United States, I do think there are some lessons that we can learn from what's just happened in the United States. Certainly, we work very closely with the Democrats, who are our sister party, and we spent quite a bit of time with them, sort of talking through the result and how they pulled off a fairly historic achievement there. It's very unusual to overturn an incumbent president seeking re-election in US history, and they managed to do it at a moment that was critical for the world. So I guess a few things that I would say. One is that you have to be present in every community, and you have to do that all year round. In many ways, politics has become very local. People don't trust the system. That's a lot to do with the sort of way in which populists on left and right have sought to shake our faith in institutions and each other over recent years. So you have to be present, not just at election time. And that means for Labour a complete overhaul of the way that we do things, because most of our decision making and resources are pushed upwards. And if we want to show people that we're serious about pushing power out to the people, then we're going to have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And that's something that Angela Rayner has been very focused on as party chair, and Annalisa Dodds, who's taken over from her, is very passionate about. I think we have to have a story to tell about the future of this country that matches the ambition of the people in it. And I don't think we have had that for quite some time. I think if we're really honest, that there are politicians on the right who have had a story, whether that story is complete and utter nonsense or not, and they have any way of delivering it, have shown ambition and optimism about the future of the country, while the left curiously hasn't. And Brexit was very much in that mould for me, is that I regretted the decision to leave the EU, but that can't be the end of the story. If we're politicians, then our job is to find a better future for this country and to show people what their role is in that. So we've got to get on the front foot and do that. And there are lots of other things I could probably say about how we do that, but probably they're two pretty big things, I think, about rooting ourselves in local communities and showing that we can deliver and having a story to tell about the future in which people have a stake. And those two things, I think, taken together would take us a very long way with the public.
Excellent. Now, Lisa, we're into the last 10 minutes or so. I'm going to try and get a fair few questions in, because we've had a lot submitted. So if I could ask you for some shorter answers to the next few, just to get a few done, I'd be really grateful. I've got a question from Rick Chandler. Do you think we should exercise our trade with Commonwealth to more advantage?
Yes. So I spent quite a bit of time with Commonwealth countries, and there's a huge amount of affection and goodwill for Britain, but there are two problems I think that hold us back. One is, I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which the Windrush scandal has affected our standing in the eyes of many partner countries, and we've got to repair that. But the second is that too often we see many of those Commonwealth countries as recipients of aid rather than countries with something to contribute. And if we could change the mindset on that, then we'd be in a far stronger position to benefit.
So, thank you. Question from Steve. Steve's asking, saying, thank you for your openness and candour. It's refreshing. Do you think that devolution could bring a collaboration to benefit Lancashire? And what do you feel about the levelling up agenda and where that's heading?
So I think devolution is the only way forward. But I would just say, if you're in Lancashire, draw some lessons from the devolution model that we were given by George Osborne here in Greater Manchester. The devolution for me has got to be about flipping the settlement, so that rather than decisions being taken at the highest, most central level, they're devolved as that you flip it so that they are automatically taken at the lowest level that they can. That's how you get people to buy in. That was a lot of the lesson of the last Labour government for me, was that for all the great things that were done, the Sure Start conceived and executed from Whitehall and funded from Whitehall doesn't survive, while the energy co-op run by hundreds of local people does and continues to survive 11 years later despite cuts to subsidies. So draw some lessons from that, because there is a difference between real devolution, where people in Wigan, Bolton, Bury, Salford feel that they have power in their hands, and just simply the transfer of power from one group of men in Whitehall to another group of men in Manchester Town Hall.
Thank you. Lisa, we've got a question from Mary-Anne, pardon me. And Mary-Anne is asking, what's your book going to be about?
Well, when I start writing it, I'm going to get in so much trouble. I really hope the publishers aren't on this call. But it's about our place in the world and where we go next. And there's a lot behind that, because that in turn is about the sort of values that we want to base this country on. What do we believe in? And the reason I'm writing it now is because I think we in the Labour Party need a story to tell about that, and that's something that Keir and his team are looking at very closely, and Annalisa Dodds, who's doing the policy review, but also because I think we are at a crossroads where people have started to reevaluate what matters to them in their lives, and perhaps want a different sort of settlement. On the one hand, we've left the EU, we've said that we're going to kind of go it alone in the world. So what does that look like? Who are we going to work with? Where are our alliances to be found? But also, what do we want to achieve? And that's about who we are as a people. And I think for me, the biggest thing about this book is that I've spent the last 11 years trying to get the voices of people in places like Wigan into national policy. And when I say that I'm going to do that in foreign policy, people think I've lost my mind. But actually, for all the reasons I gave earlier, football fraud, flooding, populism, the political upheaval that comes as a consequence of not dealing with these things, they've got to be heard. They deserve to be heard. They're smarter than we are. They saw the problems coming long before we did. And when they said the system isn't working, they were absolutely right. So I'm determined to get their voices right to the heart of what it means to what Britain is about.
Lovely. Thank you, Lisa. I've got a question from Kate. Kate's asking, what is your opinion of your party's stance as regards Nazanin Zagari Ratcliffe and the UK's relationship with Iran?
Well, Tulip Sadiq, who's my colleague, who is Nazanin's MP, has been absolutely stunning on this. And she introduced me to the Ratcliffe family when I first became the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I think if you meet Richard and their little girl, who is just, it just breaks your heart. You come away from that meeting feeling that you will do everything within your power to get Nazanin home. But Nazanin isn't the only dual national detained in Iran. There's another family, Anousheh Ashuri, and there are many, many others as well who for various reasons would rather not have the publicity, but are in similarly heartbreaking circumstances. And I think a lot of the question of this is centred around the debt that is owed to Iran for the tanks that were never supplied. I think Ben Wallace, who's the Defence Secretary, did everybody a favour by acknowledging that debt is owed. He seemed to do it, he went a bit rogue and announced that it was owed, but nevertheless, I think for better relations with Iran, that is obviously going to be a precondition of us being able to get in there and negotiate. But in the Labour Party, we're in, we take the same stance as the government. You don't negotiate with hostage takers, right? And this is exactly what is happening. This is a hostage situation. We're not going to hand over large sums of money simply to get hostages home who should never have been detained in the first place. But that is a debt that is owed under international law. That is absolutely clear. You know, finding a way to deal with that would help to at least produce better relations with Iran. You've got to do that in a way that doesn't produce adverse consequences, not just with the United States, but in the region as well. There's a lot of concern in Israel, for example, about what, you know, funding Iran and what funding Iran might mean for the safety and security of Israeli civilians. So it's a complicated and tricky thing, but it shouldn't be beyond our collective wit to solve it. And I think, you know, particularly given Boris Johnson's personal history in relation to this, I think the Prime Minister should try to use his personal authority to intervene, which he doesn't seem to have done so far. I mean, at the recent court hearing for Nazanin, Britain didn't even send representatives to observe it. That is a real dereliction of duty, I think. And so, you know, essentially, I suppose the answer is it's a complex diplomatic task, but these things have been done before. They've been done by other countries. And if we made this a priority, I'm certain that we could resolve it.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. A question from Peter. He's asking about what's your view on the standing of the UK in Europe in 2015 as compared to 2021. And he's asking on a scale of 1 to 10. But you know, what's the sort of the standing? Has that improved or has it decreased?
I think people are a bit exhausted by it. They're a bit exhausted by the government, but I think there's still a huge amount of goodwill towards Britain as a country. And not just a willingness, but a desire to work with us. And, you know, I met with counterparts recently from many of the EU countries around the G7, and all of them still express a sadness at where relations have got to between the UK and Europe. I think, you know, apart from anything else, it's not strategically in the EU's interest to have Britain acting as a malign force on the outskirts of Europe. And I think that's why the decision, you know, the recent announcements around unilaterally tearing up the withdrawal agreement and breaking international law have really sort of sent shockwaves around most of our allies around the world. I think that's why President Biden felt so very strongly about it when he came over to the UK a couple of weeks ago. And I think we can do better than this. You know, it's right that we have a robust approach to negotiations with the EU. We should stand up for our interests and we should make sure that we get a good deal in negotiations. But that surely shouldn't come at the expense of having a close relationship with people who share our values. When you look at the challenges, we talked about China, but we haven't even talked about Russia yet. And you look at those challenges, it just seems absolute madness that we wouldn't be seeking to forge much more solid alliances with people who share our values.
Well, right on cue, Lisa. The next question is about Russia. So which is good. A question from Stephen. Should we be working to block Nord Stream 2 and other such actions to contain Russia?
I mean, I've been very critical of Nord Stream 2, and I think energy security is one of the most neglected areas in foreign policy. We talk about it a bit, but we don't talk about it anywhere near as much. In fact, it's often seen as an energy issue, not a national security issue. If you look at the countries that really understand this, I mean, Russia obviously does and has done for some time because of their particularly unique geographical situation, but so too does China. And there's a reason why China is investing huge amounts in green, clean energy and the technology of the future. It's partly to reduce their reliance on the United States, but it's also in order to increase the world's reliance on China. And we've got to take that seriously. So I think we could do better than you know, two things. One is clean energy, not the fossil fuel energy of the future, and two is let's work together to make that, you know, to give us the homegrown alternative to countries like Russia and China that will protect our national security as well.
Lovely stuff. Do you know, we're at 2 minutes to 7, so I think we'll leave it there. I do apologise to everyone who's put in questions that we haven't yet got to. But Lisa, I just want to thank you very much indeed for your excellent answers and for your time now. We're very grateful. And you know, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope we can do some other things with you before too long.
In person, maybe one day. That'd be really exciting.
That'd be great. Lisa, thank you very much indeed. We're really grateful. Thanks a lot. Good. Well, look, I'm very grateful to Lisa for joining us tonight. And that's been an excellent interview, and I'm pleased that we've covered so much ground. I just wanted to mention a couple of things before we go, and that is my next interview is on the 5th of July with Simon Penny. He's the Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for the Middle East. A great person, and I think absolutely he'll come up with a great interview. So I'm looking forward to that very much indeed. And then just a little bit more about a couple of other things we've got coming up. Tomorrow we've got a special piece on modern slavery, which I think is absolutely worth getting to. The details are on the IoD London events website. So I think it's worthwhile getting involved on that modern slavery topic. I think it'll be an excellent event. Just a little bit more about the IoD for those who don't know. As Kirsty mentioned at the top of the show, that it has legal and tax helplines, which are remarkably helpful for small businesses, all of which are free, covered within the membership fee, plus also professional development courses and training, plus qualifications, and the ability to influence government and a lot of special interest groups as well. I thoroughly commend the IoD membership to you, and I look forward to seeing you at our future IoD events. I would like to thank Lisa for being a great interviewee today. Thank you very much indeed to Lisa. Thank you very much indeed to the IoD team who've helped me put this event on, which is Jeremy plus Kirsty Maxey. So thank you very much indeed to Jeremy Duncan and Kirsty Maxey. I'd like to thank Sophia and Manuela from my office who've helped me put this event on. And I'd like to thank our colleagues at Rathbones. We're very grateful to Rathbones for their continued support for this excellent series. Last of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. I've enjoyed myself very much indeed, and we're bang on 7 o'clock. Thank you for joining us now. Look forward to seeing you at the next one. All best to you all. Good night. Bye now.